This week on The Wheelhouse, predator versus prey. How understanding evolution can help us bridge political divides. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. And today we're bringing you a special conversation. We like to do this from time to time. We dive deep into a topic, one book, one guest author. And because we care about the people and approaching political conversations in healthy, productive ways, we enlisted the help of a psychologist. My guest this hour is Kurt Gray. He's a social psychologist, neuroscientist, and the Wary Foundation endowed chair in the social psychology of polarization and misinformation at The Ohio State University. Kurt serves as the director of the Collaborative on the Science of Polarization and Misinformation. Kurt joins us for the hour to talk about the book, Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Kurt Gray, hello and welcome to The Wheelhouse.
Hi, Frankie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Folks, if you want to join this conversation, do it on our socials. Find us at CT Public on Facebook and Instagram and email us at wheelhouse@ctpublic.org. It's important to note from the jump that the ideas laid out in Outraged draw from scientific research, both yours, Kurt, and the research of others. You'll talk a lot about liberals and conservatives, the left and right, Democrats and Republicans, the ways opposing groups think, and what values they prioritize. The conclusions about the way we see ourselves and others, whatever side of the aisle we sit on, are based on extensive research. You're not dabbling in opinions or tropes, and your own political beliefs don't come into play. You studied and researched the way humans interact around perceived harms and why we behave in certain ways when we don't agree or when we feel threatened. So what informs your work?
What informs my work is, as you say, so much scientific research, a lot of it that I've done in my own lab, from graduate school at Harvard University through when I was at University of Maryland to UNC to Ohio State, many places, purple states where we're trying to figure out how the left and the right think about things. And I think more than that, kind of what it means to be a political animal grounded in our understanding of human nature, right? How millions of years of evolution shaped our minds and how that shapes our political behavior today.
Part one of your book focuses on human nature. So much of human behavior can be traced back to the prehistoric predator-prey dynamic. Why can't our modern brains understand that a nasty comment on social media isn't the equivalent of a saber-toothed tiger or a large predator coming after us?
Good question. The book is really structured around some of these myths that we hold that lead us astray. And one of the most important myths that we hold about human nature is this idea that humans are innately predators, right? As kids, even as students, we're taught that we're at the top of the food chain. And it's true that today we are. We can hunt wolves from helicopters with high-powered rifles. But for millions of years, even before we were Homo sapiens, when we were evolving, we were mostly prey. We were hiding in trees, in caves, getting attacked by saber-toothed cats. And today, even though we're so much safer and there's not many saber-toothed cats around, it's hard to shake those feelings of threat, of fear. And that means that even when we're sitting safe in our homes, we're still on the lookout for those attacks. When we're on social media, for instance, we get threatened. It's easy for us to feel, literally attacked by someone on the other side when they make a comment. And those kind of attacks have replaced our fear of saber-toothed cats.
Can you help me understand what morality is and then what outrage is?
So we all know when something's right or wrong. It's this gut feeling we have, right? We feel like, oh, that's bad. I want to punish this person. But where it comes from, I think, is super interesting. And that is, think about how we evolved as prey, right? We were hunted, we were attacked. And so what prey animals do to stay safe is we form groups. Meerkats herds of impala, right? You kind of band together for safety. But what that means is that when you all live in a group, in a tribe of humans, now there's another threat, and that is other people, right? Other people can harm you, they can steal from you, they can shirk their work and make you do more. And so our sense of morality is really this innate feeling that evolved to help us live together in groups, to better cooperate, to tamp down violence, and to punish those who might harm or threaten us. So that's where it comes from, this feeling of right or wrong, to kind of help us live in groups and help us thrive when we're in tribes.
Can we get further into that? Because group living's not easy. And now you're not just worried about the saber-toothed tiger, but you're also having to develop this code, as you say, or at least this way to kind of keep others in check in our group setting here.
Exactly. I mean, we still have this concern today when we worry about crime or we gossip about our neighbors, right? We're still really fixated on how people act in groups, especially whether they're going to harm us, right? So we get alarm systems installed, right? We're worried about others. We call the police if we're worried about things, right? These are things that have its roots back millions of years ago. So you take very small hunter-gatherer societies, and they have very, similar moral codes where if someone's, harming others, if someone is taking too many resources for themselves, they punish them, they exile them, and that helps people living, together harmoniously. And of course, it's not perfect, right? There are people who exploit others, there's crime, but we're really fixated on making sure that people cooperate. And this is why, again, in modern times, we're so vigilant to threats and human predators. And this is why we can't shake the fear that, let's say your kids are playing outside on your front lawn and you see a white panel van drive slowly up the street and then back down. Your first thought isn't, I hope that locksmith finds where they're going. It is, are they kidnappers? Are they trying to steal my kids or, rob me? And so our default assumption is one of threat and one of being concerned with human predators. And so morality really evolved to kind of focus us on that and guard us against those harms.
And this is where I want to get into the concept of creep, making humans feel like we're less safe, less moral, and more vulnerable to harm, even though, as you say in the book, and you said earlier in this interview, we don't really have to worry about being eaten by a predator, or at least most of us don't, right? I know you've outlined in places where we may have to worry about that, namely in certain parts of the world in Asia and Africa. But nonetheless, we still find reasons to feel panic and outrage.
Right. And this is an amazing and crazy thing about the human mind, right? Is that even though we are really safe today, as we sit in our homes, right, the threat of wild animals is very low. The threat of predation by other human beings is really low. But for millions of years, our ancestors who had kids, who procreated, right, who were naturally selected for, were those people who were worried about threats. And so we evolved to really be worried about threats. And what this means is that when our environments are dangerous, well, we can detect them, right? Like there's a saber-toothed cat in that cave, or there's this person and he wants to kill me. But when there's not those threats, we're still really compelled to find them. We have this anxious, nervous energy to think, well, there's got to be something out there that's coming for me. And so I got to find that. And what that innate drive to find threats does is it elevates things that are actually not that dangerous to the status of actual threats. Right. So one example I cover in the book is, a woman lets her kids walk home, half a mile to her house in the middle of the day through a suburban neighborhood. And someone calls the cops on her, right? This child endangerment. And this is crazy. You go back 50 years and you say, I'm letting my kid walk by themselves, in my neighborhood. There's I don't see the problem. But today, because we're so safe, right, we see those things as dangerous threats to children. And so you can argue that the concept of what's harmful has crept. It's expanded to include more really banal and benign things.
I'm particularly interested in the way outrage manifests online and what ways is the internet sort of designed to encourage moral outrage.
Yeah, it really is designed to encourage moral outrage. So, one kind of myth about outrage on the internet is that people are just trying to score points. It's like performative, right? Like I'm getting angry just so I look good to other people in my group or my feed. But our research suggests that it's really, again, like morality, driven by feelings of threat or fear. And so, what social media does is it creates a limitless supply of threats, right? Like this person is doing this law and it's going to be terrible for the country. This person in your community is out to get you, right? There's global warming, there's war, too much immigration, not enough immigration, all these threats. And then what social media does is it gives you these virality metrics. Right? Thousands of people are worried about this threat. Millions of people are talking about like this predator. And that for our social minds, right? We're so attuned to what other people are worried about, really turbocharges our feelings of concern. And what we do to counter those feelings of concern, of fear, is that we feel morally outraged, right? We try to like get our pitchforks and our torches and rally everyone else together to fight those threats. But in the modern world, it doesn't really work out that way. Like it doesn't really fight those threats. It used to be, we'd all band together, get our pitchforks, and we'd like throw the bad person out of our group. But today we just end up like yelling into the algorithms, and it uses those algorithms to kind of like stoke further outrage. So it's designed to get us angry, but we can't really do anything about it.
You were looking at virality metrics. Could you look at certain panics that we found in social media and certain times that we were outraged over certain things?
I mean, it's so easy to think about panics every day. I mean, you just have to log in to social media. But, we can go back to history. We can think about reefer madness. We can think about Dungeons and Dragons, right? Being a satanic cult. This is ages ago about Obama taking away people's dishwashers, or gas stoves, or too much population or not enough population, right? Like if there's a potential way that some social trend or some current event could cause harm, what social media does is really amplifies that. Even traditional media, right? You get more clicks when you get more fear. And so social media is a powerful way of getting people to see those threats and click them, and it drives engagement.
There was a year that you studied, or you looked at a research study where there was a panic every day online?
Sure. Yeah. I think it was something in the late aughts that said this is the year of moral outrage, and they revealed a panic for every day.
And they were able to track it through metrics.
Exactly, right. And other studies show that when there's threats, there's outrage. And when there's outrage, there's feelings of threats and there's more engagement. And so how do you count the grains of sand in the desert? There's just so many every day. Everything could be carcinogenic, everything could be harmful. And then I think a couple of years later, I think it was Slate magazine concluded that, every year is a year of moral outrage. Every day is a day of moral outrage on social media because it's just always there.
Let's get into our mental health here. Is there any part of the human condition that draws us to feeling outraged in the way that is there something innate in us that wants to be riled up? I guess sometimes it does feel good to be mad.
I mean, it's functional, right? It's functional to be outraged. There's lots of good examples, especially at the local level, where outrage can be really useful, right? If something's bad happening in your community, let's say there's there's a crooked cop, and everyone in the community recognizes this, and they get really mad. They go to city council, and they chant, they protest, and maybe the cop gets fired. Okay, that's a good example of outrage being useful. Unions protesting something, another good example. And it feels good that way because you're affecting change. You're getting together with people in your community and you're getting something done. Like that's what outrage is really evolved for. In the modern world, you're getting outraged with people on social media who you don't know who they are. They're faceless. You can't really coordinate together. And you're not really doing anything, right? You're just kind of fomenting up each other's outrage. It's like a weird perversion of this like deep historic and evolutionary power that we have to get outraged, because now we're angrier than ever, but it's not really achieving that much because we're not translating the feeling into action. And then to go to the mental health aspect, it makes us stressed. I'm really proud of this book, but I also understand that lots of people listening are like, I don't know if I can read another book about outrage in politics because I feel it so much. And we found in our studies that people who use social media to check in about politics and pay attention to the virality metrics have symptoms of PTSD that are above often clinical threshold. And so, it's not good for us to really focus on these metrics, but I think it is useful to understand where this outrage comes from.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You're listening to my conversation with Kurt Gray. He's the author of Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Coming up after the break, Kurt helps us understand morality in the context of our evolutionary desire to avoid harm.
My work is really saying that underneath any values or foundations or whatever you want to call it, it's all about protecting ourselves, our families, and our communities.
We'll be right back. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're spending the hour with Kurt Gray. He's a social psychologist, a professor at The Ohio State University, and the author of Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Kurt's book happened to be my beach read on a family vacation. So my copy is stained with suntan oil forever, and there's sand in the spine. And if it's any consolation to him, I learned a ton from him about how understanding human evolution can help frame political disagreements today. Part 2 of Outraged focuses on the moral mind. Folks want to join the conversation with Kurt on our socials. We're at CT Public on Facebook and Instagram. Email us to wheelhouse@ctpublic.org. I want to understand a little bit more about why you've done what you've done with your colleagues. It's really fascinating. You've been able to learn under Jonathan Haidt. He's someone who has popularized and developed moral foundations theory, but it's something that you wanted to dive deeper into and then maybe correct. Can you just help us understand why it's important to look at moral foundations theory and where harm kind of plays into this?
So you can think of the evolution of my field, which is moral psychology, really understanding, not what is right or wrong, but how people make decisions and judgments about right or wrong. That field is really debating like how much our moral judgments are based in concerns about harm. At the very beginning of the field, everyone says, look, everything's all about harm. When you ask kids what's right or wrong, they will say, well, what's wrong is what's harmful, right? It's wrong to punch a classmate, and it's not that wrong to wear pajamas to school if the teacher lets you, because that's not about harm. What happened is that some folks went to other cultures and found that, look, these other cultures seem to judge as wrong some things that are not obviously harmful, like eating chicken after your father's funeral, let's say, is a famous example. It doesn't seem harmful to people in the West, and yet people condemn it in this kind of rural Indian town. And so what John Haidt did was he took that finding and he argued that, look, we must have a moral mind divided into different concerns, some about harm and some that are grounded in harmless things, like violations of purity, like eating chicken or burning a Bible. Moral psychology is filled with all sorts of weird examples. And so, right, moral foundations theory is this idea that we have different foundations, different values divided in our minds and really separate. And that theory argues that conservatives have more foundations than liberals. And then my work is really a kind of let's go back to this deeper understanding of harm. And I argue that, look, there's no such thing as kind of separate foundations in the mind. Of course, there's separate values that we care about, but really everything comes down to harm. And if you really learn about why people condemn impurity or disloyalty or dishonor, it's because they ultimately link those things to harm. And so my work is really saying that underneath any values or foundations or whatever you want to call it, it's all about protecting ourselves, our families, and our communities.
My comprehension is that where you and Haidt sort of branch off is that harm, at least as you and your colleagues understand it, is more intuitive. It doesn't necessarily rely on taking time to rationalize something. So can you help me understand the tests that your colleagues sort of put this idea under and what you all found?
I think a good way to think about it, before I get into the studies, is that when we get a sense of danger or threat, it's really visceral, it's intuitive. And so, if you are standing on the Grand Canyon skywalk, which is this, transparent bridge into nothing, into nowhere, and you can see down 4,000 feet into the canyon floor below, it's going to be terrifying, right? And you're going to feel afraid, even if you know in your head you're perfectly safe. And so that's what harm is like, not only when it comes to heights, but also when it comes to morality. We're kind of like viscerally concerned, right? When that white panel van drives across our house, we think, oh no, right, that's a kidnapper. I bet they're evil. And so the studies we did, and they were a ton of fun to do, to show that concerns about harm were visceral, is we put people into situations that they knew were harmless, but seemed harmful. And what we found is that they still have a kind of really intense bodily reaction to these apparent harms. So I'll give you an example. In one situation, we had an accomplice sit there, kind of lounging back in an office chair, and we replaced his leg, his like shin, with a piece of PVC piping and covered it with a khaki. So it looked like his leg. And then we asked people to hit his quote leg with a hammer as hard as they could. Now they knew it was fake, but they sure had this visceral sense of I don't know if I should do that, right? That's really hard to do, even if you know it's fake, because concerns about harm are visceral, they're intuitive. And so that's what the theory that I argue for, that we have a harm-based mind, is really about. That we condemn things that seem harmful in our bodies, in our viscera, and not just kind of this conscious, rational kind of sense of harm.
Vulnerability and the AOV, the assumption of vulnerability, play significant roles in our perceptions of whether or not a person or their ideas may harm us. Can you explain AOV to me and how it feeds into today's modern culture wars that are super political?
Yeah. I think it's useful to take a step back and say, look, if all our judgments are grounded in harm, it's great to understand how our mind works. But at the end of the day, liberals and conservatives still disagree about morality. So how can you get differences in morality and politics from the same harm-based mind? Right? This is what someone like John Haidt might say, right? You need these different foundations. And to that, I'd say you don't need those foundations, because what you have is you have people who disagree about what is most vulnerable to harm in society, or who. And so we've asked thousands of people to tell us who they think is really most vulnerable to being victimized or mistreated or harmed. And we find some really big differences between liberals and conservatives, differences that explain the culture war. And so we ask about 4 different groups. They are the environment, like coral reefs, planet Earth, the rainforest, right? How vulnerable are those to harm? We've got the othered, people who are outside the kind of dominant center of society, like trans folks or undocumented immigrants or Muslims. We've got the powerful, like cops, corporate leaders, and then we've got the divine. like God, Jesus, the Bible, right? So those four things. Now, everyone agrees, there's some agreement here. Everyone agrees that the othered and the environment are most vulnerable to harm. And then we've got the powerful and the divine. So everyone agrees on the order of those things. But there's really big differences across politics on the relative perception of those, which is liberals, committed progressives, right? They see the environment and the othered as really vulnerable to harm, and powerful people and the divine as really not vulnerable to harm. So liberals, in this sense, divide the world into the kind of oppressed groups and oppressors, which is why, they're more likely to argue for Black Lives Matter, eat the rich, right? Like we've got some folks who you really need to protect and other folks who are not at all vulnerable to harm and who are in fact doing the harming. Conservatives, committed conservatives, on the other hand, don't really divide the world into the really vulnerable and invulnerable and see everyone as fairly similar in terms of their vulnerability, right? Everyone's equal, everyone's born equal, everyone makes choices. It's kind of like this really classic, like small L liberal sense from the Enlightenment, right? That we're all here, we're all equal. If you cut one of us, we all bleed the same. And so conservatives are more likely to argue against affirmative action because they're like, look, everyone should deserve the same chance to get into college. They're more likely to argue for Blue Lives Matter because, cops can be harmed just as much as Black folks who are stopped in a traffic stop.
One example you use in the book is that a conservative might see taxing somebody to support another person's health care as actually stealing from them.
That's right. If we all deserve to keep our money and we're all equally vulnerable to harm, then why should one person's money get stolen to help another person? That's exactly right.
Does the latter way of thinking about things, that we're all equal, ignore aspects of history?
I think it does. I mean, I'm a social psychologist, and what I study is often how context, and increasingly, we study how the arc of history, as many people have long known, can impact the current situation. And so it's certainly the case that, there are some members of some groups who are much more likely to be victimized and harmed. But a conservative might argue that what liberals kind of forget when they talk exclusively about group-based differences is that there's variability within groups. So some people, even within racial groups or religious groups, might be more likely to be harmed. And at the end of the day, right, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black or white. If your kid suffers, if your kid gets harmed, if you get hit by a car, right, you suffer too. And so conservatives focus more on this kind of individual-based sense of victimization, and progressives more on group-based. And we can argue one might allow for more nuance than the other, but I think there's certainly more than a grain of truth to both conceptions of victimhood.
We all know what typecasting is in Hollywood, but can you explain what moral typecasting is and how it perpetuates a villain versus victim dichotomy?
Right. So we all know typecasting, right? Daniel Radcliffe, forever Harry Potter. And so the reason that typecasting exists with, Hollywood is because we try to simplify the world, right? In our minds, we try to simplify. And we especially try to simplify the world when it comes to morality, right? We don't like thinking in shades of gray. It's hard to be nuanced when it comes to good and evil. And so we typecast others as either villains or victims in our minds. When there's an ongoing conflict like the Middle East, or maybe a disagreement in our workplace, right, at a much smaller scale, we say like this person or this group, like they're the villain here, they're to blame. And this other group, they're innocent, they're suffering, they're being harmed. And so, of course, it's very complicated, a lot of moral situations, but we try to ignore that and in our minds, and we just say, look, here's the villain, here's the victim, end of story.
There's a type of moral typecasting that shows up on the playground. Even kids are attuned to this tactic?
They are. I think everyone's kind of intuitively attuned to this idea, which is why it resonates with people, I think, so well. If there's some dust up on the playground, everyone knows that whoever the real victim is, right, they get to escape blame, and that makes the other person the villain. And so when my kids fight, and I get angry, they both, grab some body part and start crying and say the other one started it because they know that, the person who's the villain gets in trouble and the person who's the victim gets off. And of course, in this case, with my kids, they're both villains, and my wife and I are the real victims as they're fighting and making life terrible for us sometimes.
And my kids, especially when they're in the pool, Charlie did this. Annie hurt me. Annie said something to me. They just want you to yell at the other person. That's
Exactly. And, you're arguing with a coworker, with a spouse, and especially when it comes to us, right? Because we are so tuned into when we're suffering and we're not as tuned into other people's suffering, right? Because suffering happens in our minds, that it's easy for us to feel like the victims and that the other people are villains when, of course, everyone's really just doing their best in the world most of the time.
It always sounds a little Pollyanna-ish to say we're more alike than different, but science actually supports this. Can you talk about the similarities of opposing sides, specifically as it relates to our fear of harm?
I think this is really where we can find common ground. And I think typecasting gets in the way of this. There's let's say there's 1% of the world who are psychopaths, right? We can and they may be overrepresented in, I don't know, cable news or politics, but everyday people at the end of the day, right? We're just trying to protect ourselves. And when people cast a vote, give money to political campaigns, it's not because they think I'm trying to burn down the world like some supervillain. Instead, they're trying to protect themselves, right? They're trying to safeguard their interests and their people. And so I think that's what we really need to keep in mind.
Despite the fact that at our core we're more alike than different, your research also found that when people agree with us, they're smart. When they don't, we think they're stupid. Why do we do this?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a bunch of studies on this, and it always comes out, right? A lot of people think that morality is truth and that good or evil are objective states in the world. And so what that means is that if someone disagrees with you, then they're either idiots because they're not seeing something that's right in front of them, or they're evil and they are denying the truth of morality to kind of get ahead. And so we have lots of studies, where we ask people to just rate the intelligence of people who vote differently, to ask why someone votes a certain way. And people will say, well, the other side's stupid. They get tricked. They're brainwashed. They're like sheeple. But the truth of the matter is that we're all pretty much the same intelligence on average. And that when, when we're stupid, it's when we're trying to twist the facts to kind of support our views. And whether you're left or right leaning, everyone kind of cooks the books in a sense to support your own political views.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. We all become all of a sudden terrible at math when it turns out that the math supports the other side. And so in some ways, we're equally smart and we're equally stupid, depending on which way the facts lean.
Victimhood is even more interesting than villainy because we can see others as victims and feel outrage on their behalf. But we can also see ourselves as victims. And this is a very negative place to be. And people can get stuck there. How does the villain-victim scenario often play out?
It's so easy to see yourself as a victim. And that's because if you suffer, if you're in pain, that feeling is so powerful. It's so overwhelming, right? I think there's one line in the book that says something like, it's hard to plan for retirement, but it's almost impossible if you're standing, in a pile of razor blades. And so pain, physical pain, but also emotional pain, it just overwhelms us and it fills our whole consciousness. And if you are feeling pain, then you look for others to blame for that suffering. And it's easy to kind of cultivate that habit of mind when society is telling us you're a victim and there's other people out there to blame for your plight. And so we get in this habit where we kind of well, this person's the villain and this person's the villain and I'm really the victim. Even if you're not, currently suffering, it's easy to play what some people call the victim Olympics. For instance, on social media, everyone's competing to show that they're the real victims, and that makes everyone else the villain.
I don't ever want to be in the victim Olympics, but maybe when I'm feeling gray one day. Sorry, that wasn't a play on your name. but maybe when I'm feeling that way, I might have to do that. It sounds like you could score some points online and it'll be rather performative.
You score points online. You score points in conversation. You can score points in the courts. Our entire moral minds are really structured to kind of protect victims and to punish villains. And so if there's some kind of moral debate, even if no one wants to, feel like a victim, everyone would rather be called the victim than be called the villain, because victims escape blame and villains get punished.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You're listening to my conversation with Kurt Gray. He's the author of Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. It's time for a break. When we get back, more from Kurt. We're going to get to the finding common ground part of his book's title and learn how our perception of harm is the key to bridging divides. Stay with us. The Wheelhouse is coming back soon. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're talking with Kurt Gray for the entire hour. He's a social psychologist, a professor, and the author of my beach read, Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. You spent some time in part 3 of Outrage talking about the problem of facts. What is it about our human nature that refuses to be moved by facts?
Yeah. This is a myth. We've been talking about all these myths, the myth of human nature, the myth of our moral mind. And the myth of facts is the one that was most surprising to me, especially as a scientist, right? I trade in facts every day. We base our lives and our society around facts. But when it comes to morality, facts do not work to increase respect, although we think they do. When we ask, thousands of people, what should someone do on the other side in a conversation for you to respect them? If you're talking about politics, they'll say, well, give me the facts. And so we say in our studies, great, here are the facts that they're giving. And then people say, not those facts. Those are not the real facts. I want the facts that support my side. And so, we live in different fact bubbles, in echo chambers where people have their own facts. And so it turns out that giving people facts is not useful for having more civil discussions. Instead, what's more powerful is sharing stories, giving people your own experiences, especially those about harm.
Walk us through this example from a relatively recent moment. A person believes undocumented people should be deported because they're criminals, making our country less safe. But the facts may not show that to be exactly true. Why should I then give credence to their view of harm? Their view of harm isn't based on reality. So what do you do then?
I guess we could take a step back and saying, I'm not saying that people should relinquish their moral convictions. I'm not saying that people should change their understanding of harm. But what I am saying is that, look, if you want to understand where the other side's coming from, if you want to have a conversation with, I don't know, your uncle or your cousin or your neighbor, then we need to resist this idea that the other side is evil or just stupid. And so to do that, I think what we need to do is really understand the harms that people are intuitively, remember, it's like this visceral sense that they're feeling, right? And so you could imagine that maybe a neighbor had a family member, that was hurt by an undocumented person, or in their mind, an illegal immigrant, right? Like that they're having, a personal experience where someone they know suffered because of illegal immigration. And that experience shapes their worldviews and give rise to their moral convictions. And what we show in our studies is that people can respect that more than just throwing some factoid about, they heard on Fox News this thing and what do you think about this fact? People dismiss that immediately. But if someone says, look, even if I know there's statistics out there that you're talking about, at the end of the day, I'm really worried, or I'm really worried about losing a job because my job gets outsourced or something, you can understand that a little more.
And what I'd like to understand more about is the power of storytelling. Can you talk more about that?
So humans, we evolved more as prey than as predators. And we definitely evolved more as storytelling creatures than as statistical creatures. I mean, I teach statistics to college students. It's a real pain. It takes a whole semester to wrap your head around those ideas. On the other hand, if I tell you a story about, this is a true story that opened the book up, about how I was a victim of road rage when I was a teenager, right? Another car chased me into a darkened parking lot and slapped me around and threatened to kill me. It was terrifying, right? And I think listeners can understand how that would be terrifying for me.
Yeah, and you're reading the book, it's terrifying too.
Right. And the fact of the matter is, I want to say fact, like I cut this guy off, right? And so his anger is kind of like righteous indignation. But everyone can understand how I was totally afraid, even if the kind of situation is more complicated than just my fear. But again, right, we're storytelling creatures. You get it. You get how chasing me in the dark streets, and threatening to pull me out of the car and slapping me around, how that could shape my feelings and my moral convictions, right? It's kind of self-evident. And so when we're engaging with other people, what we need to draw out of them is not factoids they heard on social media. It's their stories, right? If you want to talk to someone, don't ask them about like, hey, what statistics did you hear on NPR? It's, where did your views come from? Tell me about, yourself and your own personal experiences.
One worry you mentioned early on in Outraged is that the problem of outrage and polarization feels so big, people won't even try to engage with people they disagree with. So what tips can you offer to get around this?
I want to encourage people to try. Almost every time I have a conversation with someone on the other side, it goes better than I think it will. And I teach a class where, I get students to have conversations about morality and politics with their grandparents, with their roommates, with strangers. It always goes better than you think. Trying to see the humanity in people, I think, is always worthwhile. So how do you have those conversations though, right? And so there's a couple tips, or really 3 tips in the book, and they are CIV, the beginning of civil conversations, and they are connect, invite, and validate, CIV. And you can use this to have better conversations about anything. Connect is really about just talking to someone as a human being and figuring out who they are. And that requires asking questions. And there's a study on this, and I love it, and it seems crazy, but it's an amazing study. People really like getting asked deep questions, even commuters on the train in from suburban Chicago. All right. So if you ask people, would you rather just sit alone and listen to music, or would you rather have conversations about your deepest hopes, your darkest fears? People are like, give me the solitude. But it turns out that people love having these deep conversations, and they love being asked kind of questions that really get it to the heart of who they are. So I would encourage folks to ask those questions because it uncovers who people are. Then you invite them to share their beliefs. An invitation's key, right? You're not demanding. An invitation is, hey, I know I think you voted differently than I did in the last election, and I'm just trying to understand. And if now's not the time, that's totally fine. But I just love to know kind of what you're thinking about these issues. That's an invitation. And then the V, the validation, is once they share their beliefs, you say, thanks. I appreciate that was probably hard to share, and it's kind of messy and complicated to talk about our politics, but I just want to thank you for putting yourself out there. And so that's CIV, connect, invite, and validate.
Try is something you say you would encourage. You dedicated this book to everyone trying their best to understand. What do you say to those that can't? Maybe those that can't, for example, or couldn't, at least at the time when you wrote about it, I think in a New York Times op-ed, at least the science of you trying to understand 2 different viewpoints on the Obergefell decision in 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States decision legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. When you don't allow gay people to get married, you're not only discriminating against them, but you're depriving couples the ability to collect things like death benefits. That was one way to look at it. Another way is how people might feel harmed by a same-sex marriage. Can you help us understand the science of of that person who's anti-gay rights?
Sure. And again, I think it's always useful to understand that people are grounding their opinions, right, in these like visceral sense of threat or fear, even if, right, you disagree with those perceptions. And I think when it comes to America, especially where there's a religious divide, it's important to think this too, right? Because there are folks out there who think that there are immortal souls and that God has outlined a series of tenets, of stories, of commandments to help us keep those souls safe and help us keep society functioning in the way that it should. And so people who are against gay rights are more often religious folks, and they think that gay marriage and gay rights will undermine the functioning of the family, and that will have, in a slippery slope sense, ultimately harm civilization and society. And I think we haven't seen that occur after the legalization of gay marriage, but it doesn't mean that people aren't kind of like deeply concerned about the kind of secular turn or gay rights turn that might harm society, right? Like Billy and Bobby will be gay, they won't have kids, society will have no one to work anymore without kids. And then at the end of the day, it's basically Cormac McCarthy's The Road Nuclear Holocaust. And I know that hasn't come to pass, and I'm being a little flip about it, but I think it's important to recognize that people are genuinely concerned about these slippery slope arguments.
And it's important to talk this through because gay rights activists criticized your op-ed. You got some complaints about it, is what I'm trying to say. So I want to know what they said and then what your response is, because as I mentioned, we all want to make sure that we're giving people the opportunity to try, but it might be hard for some of us to do that because we feel like we're sacrificing a big piece of ourselves. So what were you able to say? And were you able to get some of those folks that were criticizing the op-ed to try to understand some of these folks that have differing thoughts?
I mean, it's hard to get people on social media to see anything, right? Because social media is designed to kind of foment argument. But folks who email, or especially folks that I talk with in person, right? I try to make them see that folks who are opposed to gay marriage, are really emphasizing this kind of importance of the family. And there is some economic research out there that shows that, it turns out that kids do well in, raised in families, turns out also in families, gay couples, they do well. But like the family is an important institution for people to thrive and togetherness. And so at the core, if you're concerned about keeping kids raised in families, learning strong morals to help them be functioning and proud members of society, then I think, if I explain that, people, even if they disagree with the idea, right, of course you can be a gay couple and raise good kids, they do respect the fact that everyone's trying to kind of do their best for the kids. On the other hand, I got some positive feedback from conservative Christians. One Southern Baptist preacher wrote to me and he said, well, thank you for recognizing that the reason that I'm opposed to gay rights isn't just because I'm blindly following God's will, but because I think following how I see God's will best protects Christians and America. And again, right, it's up to interpretation when we're ultimately thinking about what we think is right or wrong. But I think it's useful to see that the other side is not just trying to like stir the pot or anger, the other side, but is trying to protect what they see as, vulnerable people from threats.
Kurt Gray's book is Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. We're going to link to it on our website. Go to ctpublic.org/thewheelhouse. Kurt, thank you so much for spending the hour with us.
I appreciate it. It's nice to have a deep, thoughtful conversation about important topics.
Likewise, so important for our listeners.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Today's show was produced and edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Chloe Wynn is the producer of The Wheelhouse. Our technical producer was Gene Amatruda. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.